Welcome everybody to this session organised by the Archive for Performances of Greek and Roman Drama on performance in Antiquity. If you're watching us online, you should have two separate screens, one with the speaker and one with the PowerPoint. If you go into full screen mode, you will lose one of these screens, so just go back to keep both open. And the information for everybody, the speakers are going to present one after the other, and we'll have a discussion session at the end. For people who are watching online, please send any questions by email to the APGRD email address, which is apgrd@ox.ac.uk. So I'm going to introduce our first speaker, who's Sophie Bocksberger, lecturer in Greek at Brasenose College and at St Hilda's College. Originally from Lausanne, where she did her BA, Sophie did her thesis in Oxford, a thesis which has been published as a book in 2021 on reception of Ajax in archaic and classical Greece, which covers a very wide range of subjects: literature, art, religion, archaeology. She's a specialist, as this suggests, of Greek culture, the Greek culture of the archaic and classical periods, and she's published articles on the meaning of the dancing little bears at the Central Braron, which elucidates a mystery, on the meaning of schema and its place in narrative dance in the imperial period, and also on the notion of dance as silent poetry, among other subjects. She's a dancer herself, and she's participated in the Torch project for remaking pantomime for modern audiences. And her postdoctoral project is on ancient dance theory and its impact on ancient Greek intellectual history in the archaic and classical periods. So she's going to be presenting us some material from this project in her paper, Recovering Dance Literacy. So I'll hand over to her now.
Thank you for the kind introductions. Oh, thank you so much. Great. So dance. Dance had a prominent position in archaic and classical Greek society. It was used in cults to worship the gods, played a fundamental role in the education of youth, male and female, occupied center stage in the public festivals that punctuated civil life, and was also used as a form of entertainment at private dinner parties. Unfortunately, the amount of direct evidence that we have about the way dance was used and understood as an art form is inversely proportional to the importance it had in this period. Moreover, in the absence of any extant performance or system of dance notation, language, alongside visual evidence, is the only medium through which we can recover information about the practice of dance in the Greek and Roman world. However, language, because it is linear and sequential, presents great limitations in capturing dance, since it is a multi-dimensional art form that moves into space and unfolds in time. Anyone who has ever tried to capture a dance performance in words or in a drawing knows how difficult it is to translate any piece, no matter how short, created in this medium into another medium. If you are in doubt, look at and compare different reviews of the same dance performance. Each will probably appear to have been inspired by an entirely different piece, and not a single step of the performance could be recreated on that basis alone. Let me illustrate these limitations with some ancient evidence, one pictorial and one textual piece. So here we have three vases on which a dance scene is depicted. We can tell that each painter is trying to represent a different type of dance, but not much more. The dancers are depicted in a dynamic position, but the position is simply meant to be iconic of the type of dance it depicts. On the top right, we probably have some kind of comic dance, and this can be deduced from the padded bottoms of the dancers that they're wearing, while the pots on the bottom right are usually thought, the dancers there are usually thought to be representing a tragic chorus. We have 6 dancers dancing in unison, wearing a mask. You can see it at the brim the mask that is depicted. And finally, on the left, we have a female solo dancer, perhaps holding a crotalum, some castanet, accompanied by a female lyre player. As you can see, these images, although they are clearly referring to different types of dance performances, tell us very little about the nature of the movements made by the dancer. It is not much different from what we get when looking up the word dance in Google Image. Here I can recognize different types of dance, but being able to recognize ballet, for instance here with an arabesque, tells me very little about a story ballet such as Giselle or such as a Swan Lake. So we can see the type of dance. I'd say you have some jazz on the left and on the bottom, maybe some hip hop through the posture, but you wouldn't be able to get any movement from the image. So I think that's what's happening with the pots, basically. Now here is some textual evidence. It's an excerpt from Xenophon's Symposium, and we'll see what we can learn about ancient dance from it. Before Dionysus was visible, the Bacchic tune was played on the pipes. Then they truly admired the dancing master, for as soon as Ariadne heard the tune, her action was such that everyone would have perceived her joy at the sound. So this is an excerpt from one of the richest pieces of textual evidence from the classical period that we have about dance. But as you can see, it tells us very little again about the actual performance, about the movement that were made. We don't know what show Xenophon had in mind exactly, if he had something in mind, but we can learn the following. So the performance obviously is about Dionysus and Ariadne, so it's trying to represent a story. It is danced by two dancers. The dancers are perceived to be Dionysus and Ariadne, and that's very important. They are embodying these characters. It has suitable music for its subjects, so here the Bakeios Rhythmos played on the pipes. The audience is able to appreciate the meaning of the performance, since they admire the choreographer, not the dancers. And that's a very important point, I think, is that what is important is the success of the mimesis, rather than the dexterity of the dancers in this passage. And so the work of the Orchestro Didaskalos, the dance master, consists in creating meaning with movements and a successful mimesis in order to meet the audience's expectation. As the two pieces of evidence I have shown make it quite clear, I think reconstructing ancient dance or a performance of ancient dance as it was is impossible. Nevertheless, we can still very concretely get a better understanding of ancient dance, and actually of dance in general, with the right focus. Instead of attempting to reconstruct a performance, let alone movements, we can focus on the manner in which dance is described in order to learn about how it was conceived as an art form. What were its general principles thought to be, its laws? What was dance thought to be capable of achieving? How was it used? How was meaning created through this medium? These questions can be answered, I believe, by piecing together ancient evidence in order to reconstruct the general outline of ancient dance theory, that is, of techne orchestike, the art of dance. It is indeed my contention that the general principles of dance and the vocabulary used to express them were rather stable throughout antiquity, even if the actualization of dance, that is, its performance, is bound to have been varied and its practice ever evolving. Painting provides a good analogy. Before the turn of modernity, painting is understood as one of the mimetic arts. Its aim is to capture an aspect of reality through light and colors. The principle can be applied to works produced centuries apart. A fresco from Pompeii, a medieval triptych, a painting by Botticelli or one by Manet all depict figures that are recognizable by the viewer. A man, a woman, a goddess, or any specific character. These characters are painted on a two-dimensional surface with pigments and enable the painters to combine colors and imitate the effect of light. And yet the styles in which these are painted could not be more different given that the painters use different techniques and have different priorities. So the principles to understand the paintings are the same, even though we have such different paintings. I see it in the same way as performance in general. There is an infinite number of actualization of a play by Sophocles within a finite frame, in this case the text. Similarly for dance, there is probably an infinite number of ways of dancing Ariadne and Dionysos. But what matters is to think about how one can make an audience understand through movements that they are seeing Ariadne and Dionysos, and how that experience is translated into a written text or into speech. One of my working hypotheses, which I have had the occasion to check in several published papers, is that the vocabulary used in Greek to talk about dance in all its manifestation, words qualifying kinds of dance, different dance steps or figures, types and conceptions of movements, distinctive ways of looking at dance, is often misunderstood and mistranslated. The issue stems from two main factors. First, the vocabulary of dance in archaic and classical Greece, given how widespread dance practice was, belonged to a large extent to everyday language. Basic principles of dance theory would have been understood by a large community of speakers and as such been quite stable and uniform. The Greeks' great familiarity with dance in the archaic and classical period contrasts with the present state of affairs. Dance vocabulary, at least in languages such as English or French, is technical and lacks uniformity even among practitioners and specialists. In fact, particular communities of dancers often develop their own usage to describe and communicate with precision about certain aspects of dance, which is only understood within their own community. Second, dance theory, because of its currency in archaic and classical Greece, appears to have been more sophisticated and developed than today. And so they had words that were more sophisticated in a way to express the concepts. Consequently, the Greek language, through its vocabulary, can make distinctions regarding dance that can only be translated into English by a long periphrasis. For instance, if we translate schema simply as a dance step, a figure, or a pause, we miss what it is about. The embodiment of a particular ethos, character, pathos, emotion, or what happens to one, or praxis, action. If one translates mimesis by imitation, it becomes hard to see the core meaning of this term in the arts. The transformation of some material, some colors for paintings, stone for sculpture, body for dance, into what it is meant to represent, so that the material might become on some level what it is meant to imitate. Moreover, by understanding these distinctions made in Greek, I believe that we can refine the manner in which we look at and make sense of dance. We can recover dance literacy and become better readers of dance in general. Today, I would like to focus on one example that shows the problems we face when trying to translate technical dance-related terms. Before presenting you with some of the most useful distinctions made in ancient texts about dance, as they reflect manners of reading dance, I hope it will illustrate my general approach and give you an idea of my work. So let us start with Aristotle's famous definition of dance, of the techne heton orchestron. Just as some people imitate many things with colors, some by formal skill, others by a knack, by copying from a model, while others do it through the voice, so too in the arts we have mentioned, all of them produce mimesis in rhythm, language and melody, whether separately or in combinations. Rhythm on its own, without melody, is used by the art of dancers, since they too, through rhythms translated into movements, create mimesis of character, emotions and actions. As you can see, these words, the word used in this definition in bold are simple, but actually quite tricky to understand, and they are quite tricky to translate. As a result, it is difficult to grasp what it means. And so I have translated myself the first part, but the second part I've left as it is in the loop, because we're going to go through this translation and see how we can make better sense of it. So what is a mimesis of character, emotion and action? What does it mean for the dancer to use rhythm on its own? What are rhythms translated into movements? Why is Aristotle not using the verb kinein, but schematizein? The first thing to note is that here Aristotle is giving us a definition of dance as a mimetic form of art. In order to make his point, he compares the poetic arts, that is the three elements of musique, music, poetry and dance, which in a sense is what we could call performative arts, to painting in order to explain the means through which these media are able to achieve mimesis. Painting uses colors, and that's the material through which it is made, and schemata, what makes the subject of imitation recognizable. I think that his mentioning of ten mimesin en rythmo kai logo kai harmonia refers to the core material in which mimesis is achieved in dance. So, rythmos in poetry, logos, and harmonia for music. So that's the material through which the mimesis is made. But these elements can be obviously combined, since in a performance of musique, the words and the music can contribute to shape the way we read the movements and vice versa. He then develops his definition of dance as a mimetic art form. In order to understand the word rythmos in the context of dance, it is important to be aware that it does not mean rhythm as we understand it in English. Benveniste defines it in the following way. When Greek authors use the word schema for the word rythmos, or when we translate rythmos with the word form, it is in both cases only an approximation. There is a difference between schema and rythmos. Schema characterizes a fixed and realized form, understood in a way as an object. On the contrary, rythmos designates a form at the very instant at which it is assumed by something that is otherwise moving, mobile, and fluid. The form of something that has no organic consistency. Therefore, I think that here Aristotle means that at its core, the art of the dancer in general consists in making his movements fit the time frame provided by the rythmos. And so the rythmos has a shape, has a form, because of the time through which you create this shape, if you see what I mean. And so the dancer is adapting to this rythmos rather than to the harmonia of the music, this part of the music. He then completes his definition by focusing on mimetic dance. What the dancer is able to do is to embody, which is, I think, the best way to translate mimestai here, a particular ete, pate, and praxis by creating shapes, so with a certain duration, the rythmoi, which are schematizomenoi. Now, the proper understanding of the term schema, which is used in this passage both in relation to painting and dancing, is crucial, as the notion is at the core of visual mimetic art theory. Here's the definition given by Aristoxenus. Among the bodies whose nature it is to be shaped, schematizestai, none is identical with any of the shapes, schemata. Schema is rather a certain arrangement of the parts of the body produced by virtue of each of them, that is, the bodies whose nature it is to be shaped, having a certain disposition. This is why it is called schema. So apologies for the very abstract definition, but that's the best definition we have in ancient texts. The link between schema and the verb echo, to skein in the passage, is very clear. Schema is the result of a given arrangement, the diathesis, of the parts of the body produced by the state, to skein horse, it finds itself in, which is the very reason why it is called a schema. So you have ske, this root from echo. In the first part of the sentence, Aristoxenus establishes a fundamental distinction. Bodies, somata, which are by nature subjected to schemata, so tape fukota schematizestai, are distinct from the schemata. This is all the a body necessarily finds itself in a certain disposition or state, it is not identical with this state. As for the second part of the sentence, starting with schema is rather, I take it to mean that a schema refers to the way a body organizes itself under the influence of certain factors. This is to say, in the case of a human body, that a particular schema would refer to the way joy or grief, for example, may physically affect someone and change his posture as well as his or her movements. Consequently, the schema does not refer to the dance steps as such, but to the way a dancer can create a character through his embodiment of a certain ethos, so a certain character. Things happening to this character, so the pathos, and thus by combining the ethos and the pathos, the action or a narrative. So if you establish in your body a character that you are representing, and then you show while staying in character certain pate occurring to you, then a narrative can emerge and there is a story, which I take to be the praxis. Let me give you an example. In our ancient evidence, a distinction is made between different styles of dance: emeleia for tragedy, courdax for comedy, and sikinis for satyr plays. Although each of these styles would probably fit the type of characters we find in each of these dramatic genres, it would still be possible to represent the same schema in each style. So, for instance, if one of the characteristic of the chorus was to be old, it would be possible to represent old age through the body in a mimetic way, through the imitation of its schema, no matter what style of dance is used. So you could do it in a sikinis, you could do it in an emeleia, and you could do it in a courdax, because the schema has principles that remain stable, that you can do in different ways of moving. Therefore, to go back to Aristotle's definition, I think that it suggests that mimetic dance is about establishing ete, pate, and praxis through the imitation of schemata that are done through abstract movements that fit the rhythm of the music, or the time frame, rather, of the music. It is not the step itself that means something, but the schemata in movement that the dancer adopts in order to execute them. Simply while walking on stage, a member of the chorus can imitate the schema of a woman, of a maenad, of a Persian, of an old man, or of a satyr. By being able to walk like these different characters, the chorus dancer would seem to have become what he's imitating. Through my work, I have started to form also the outline of a general ancient dance theory, which I believe could help improve our dance literacy, so the way we construct meaning when we look at dance. Something that is not very developed nowadays. Many people are touched by dance, but how can we mediate this response into language? How can we make meaning with what we see, rather than thinking only about the emotional response or the affect it has on us? So to finish off, I'd like to show you some of the outlines of this general ancient dance theory. But I must warn you that it is still pretty much a work in progress. So here is a diagram based on the discussion of dance at the end of Plutarch's table talk. I'd like to briefly examine these three concepts in the line of Ammonius' theory in Plutarch's text. So he says that the parts of dance are three. So fora, schema, and deixis. So let us start with the fora. They call fora movements. And again, fora is indicative, expressive, for emphaticon, of something like pathos, praxis, or dynamis. Here, fora refers to movements when considered abstractly. I think it is similar to rythmos, except that here Ammonius is not interested in the way dance interacts with the music. However, it is important to note that Ammonius suggests that abstract movements can nonetheless be expressive of something, and so it can express a pathos, a praxis, or a dynamis. I still need to find out what is meant really by dynamis. It's a very broad meaning, but I think we can at least suspect that what he means is that when, for instance, we look at the speed of execution of movements, of abstract movement, the speed itself can express emotion. Then we have the schema, so abstract dance for her. The schema, so similarly in dancing, the schema imitates or represents mimetic honesty, appearance and semblance. Schema then, as we discussed, is the notion that is linked to mimetic dance. And it is precisely the capacity to imitate schemata that enable dancers to imitate reality by embodying what they represent, and thus by mimicking the outward appearance of people or things. The second passage, while schemata are the states and arrangements which the dance movements result in, as when they sustain in the manner of painting the ideas, that is of Apollopan or that of a Bacchant, in the body by arranging the schema of Apollopan or a Bacchant. In this passage, Ammonius makes some essential remarks about schemata. To embody Apollopan or a Bacchant, a dancer needs to reproduce their schema, that is, their particular physicality, which is a mixture of posture, general movements, and quality of movements. The apparent fixity of a schema only stems from its identification with a crystallized notion or crystallized image of the object of imitation. So if I think of a horse, for instance, in my mind, I think I'm more likely to have a fixed image of the horse, even though I know that the horse is alive and moving in reality. So in a way, when we say schema of joy, we think of a fixed notion, but its realization in the body will be moving because dancers are imitating alive things in that instance. And then we have a third part of dance, which is deixis. The third element, deixis, is something that is not mimeticon, but deloticon, so not imitative, but indicative, since the things are actually being suggested or implied, so that's the tone hypokeimenon. And the second passage, so the things themselves are precisely shown through deixis, the earth, the sky, themselves, or bystanders. If this is done with precision, so to say, and timing, it resembles proper names in poetry when they are uttered with a measure of ornamented swiftness. So here we have a third category, so the deixis, which is said to be deloticon. It is sometimes translated by pointing, as such movement permits one to refer precisely to something. So if you have a dancer and I point at the glass, obviously it's very clear what I mean, because I'm referring to the thing that is there. I think, though, that it is used for movements that have also a coded meaning. By this I mean that it operates like a word, and hence the example that is used here in Athenaeus. So if I do the following gesture, thumb up, this has a meaning that is coded. We understand what it means by convention, and so that's another way in which dance means that is very different from the schema, because the schema is about imitating reality, while when we have a coded gesture, we have assigned the meaning through convention. So it's like a word that, if I say cat, what I say is not related to how a cat looks. And so that's another way in which we can create meaning in a dance, in movements. What I find particularly interesting also with these notions is that they aren't merely component of dance, mere we had before. The use of mimeticon, emphaticon, and deloticon suggests that each of these parts are also a distinct mode through which we can apprehend dance and construct meaning out of it. I think, though, that there is a fourth dimension of dance, which is also something that I base on ancient evidence, but it's much more indirect, and so I don't have time here to expose it fully. But it is the metaphora. So This fourth dimension refers to the way we read metaphorically or symbolically movement, and it is indeed metaphora. The earlier instance of this word in Gorgias is epiphora, so what is assigned onto the fora, perhaps. For instance, we may associate light movements with carefreeness, while we may construct a fall as a disaster of some kind happening or as a failure. These are ways in which we construct the meaning in a metaphorical way, because obviously we assign certain properties to the literal lightness that we see in the dancer. So here it's quite interesting because dancers are using often metaphorical language that we have in words and transferring it or using it literally in the dance, and we create the meaning like that. But it can be also how, if you see an ensemble of dancers dancing together in harmony, and it expresses order, and so you assign like bigger concepts with the metaphorical dimension. It is also a mode of creating meaning that is very open, just like poetry, and it demands an active participation from the audience. So we can always read more metaphorical meaning into the dance, and that's what makes it, I think, very exciting. So finally, I'd like to show you an excerpt from a recent production of the Inde Galante by Rameau at the Paris Opera, staged by Clément Cogitor. The dance sequence you are going to see is complex, but I'd like you to try to be aware of where you put your attention while watching. So, here it is. So first you could be looking at the fora, thinking about how the shapes are being made, enjoying the abstract forms the dancers create. But perhaps you can read emotion in the speed of the execution. I think it's very obvious. You could also be looking at the schemata. What kind of characters are they embodying? How are they managing to sustain their ethos? You can obviously think also about this metaphorical dimension. So when they turn, the sense of perhaps freedom that it evokes. But the tension in the body expresses and here like the collapse. which are interacting with what they're doing. So it talks about the peaceful forests and this contrast is also quite interesting. And then, like, when they go down, what kind of emotion does it suggest? And this gesture like this, probably a sort of form of deixis. Yeah, another use of deixis where the gesture itself has a meaning. So to conclude, I'm particularly grateful to be speaking at the APGRD today because it is thanks to Fiona's support and the wonderful work that is done at the APGRD in general that my colleague Helen Slaney and I started many, many years ago, our practice-based research on Roman pantomime. Although I had then already danced for almost 30 years up to a professional level and absolutely loved this art form, I must confess that I was a bit illiterate when it came to read dance. Although I knew how to appreciate the craft, I did not have a clear understanding of how to look at it and how to make meaning out of it. It is only by studying all the ancient evidence available and observing in the series of workshops we organized, over 30 dancers tried to recreate their own Roman pantomime, that the distinctions made in these sources started to become concrete. As I embarked on this area of study, it became increasingly clear to me that through this line of inquiry, we might open up a whole new aspect on our understanding of ancient dance and ancient theatre and its society that has been almost utterly lost to us. Moreover, it exemplifies how we can use contemporary performances in order to grasp the distinction the text is trying to make. Whatever the culturally specific details, I believe that the principles of dance I have outlined remain consistent. I hope these distinctions have also started to become more concrete for you, and that I have managed to show how fruitful it can be to combine practice-based research with philology. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sophie, for that very vivid presentation, and especially with the literal deixis at the end you treated us to. And now we're going to pass straight on to our second speaker, who is Sarah Cullinan-Herring, who is Hodie Fellow in Classics at Wadham College. She did her BA and her MST at Oriel College and her DPhil at University College in 2012. Embedded song in Greek narrative poetry with a special interest in embodiment, which is, I think, something that will come out in her presentation today. She's lectured at both Balliol and Trinity colleges before becoming head of classics at Winchester, and then coming back to Oxford at Wadham. She's published on a wide variety of topics: Virgil, early Greek epic, and embedded song and poetic authority in Pindar and Bacchylides.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. So what I'd like to do today is to share with you some scenes from Apollonius, from his epic about Jason and the Argonauts, specifically focusing on Medea and how she's shown as a song performer, and read those scenes through the lens of performance theory. I'm particularly interested in Austin's work on illocutionary speech acts, so speech acts which actually do something rather than merely represent something. So thinking of things that are effective rather than merely descriptive. So a modern example would be a judge pronouncing someone guilty, or the famous "I now pronounce you man and wife," which obviously changes the reality for the participants who hear the speech act. This sort of speech act, Austin argues, depends on a supporting framework of law, ritual and custom, which validates the effect. I'm also interested in kind of bringing in a little bit of Judith Butler, because she built on Austin's work to explore the ways in which linguistic constructions create the reality around us through the application of speech acts that we all participate in every day, showing how we enact the reality by speaking it or performing it. In the performative act of speaking, she sort of was very interested in the creation of gender identity, which is relevant to our discussion because I want to show how I think Medea's songs recreate her own gender identity and kind of recreate Jason's gender identity in quite interesting ways as well. So in Apollonius, I'm hoping to convince you that we see Medea appropriating the voice of the bard, working in a framework of male-authored and male kind of performed songs, and also usurping the role of not only the narrator in this poem, but also the hero of the poem. Just for those of you who haven't yet had a chance to read this wonderful poem, and I envy you if you've still got that ahead of you. The kind of main facts you need to know about, we've got Medea. She's the maiden daughter of Aeetes, king of Colchis. She has fallen in love with Jason, who's the hero of the Argonautic expedition, and he's Greek at first sight. And in book 3 of the poem, which is where we're going to start, she has decided to arrange a meeting with Jason at a temple so that she can help him defeat her father's supernatural force of earth-born men and his fire-breathing bulls, which Jason needs to do in order to get hold of the golden fleece. Jason, we will find out, accepts her help and defeats those obstacles, and this infuriates the king, who immediately suspects that there's no way a mortal hero could have done this without help from one of his daughters. So that's the kind of framework that we're working in. So if we just have a look at the first time that we kind of get an impression that Medea might be someone who engages in song or have a propensity for song is actually before we really see her doing any magic. So there are 2 passages in book 3 in the run-up to her meeting with Jason. So she's seen Jason at this point and fallen in love with him, but they haven't actually met or kind of interacted with one another. So she's waiting for Jason to turn up to this secret meeting where she plans to hand over the drugs which he can use to defeat the Earthborn men. And in both of these passages, and we're just going to look at them one at a time, we can see that the poet wants us to think of her as someone who is involved in song. So here on this first passage, you can see she's talking to her maidservant, and she says, we're waiting here, we might be here a while, let's satisfy our hearts with gentle song. What's interesting about this passage, and the one that I'll show you in a second, is that the commentators on it, who are largely male, have sought to deny that what Medea is doing here has anything to do with song. So Hunter, in his CUP commentaries, one of the most canonical commentaries on this text, translates molpe here, to the bolded word in line 2, as a game, and he says not singing. So yes, he says it's definitely not singing. However, he cites as support for this the later passage in the same book, which again is Medea potentially engaging in song, and also a very famous Odyssey passage where Nausicaa and her maidens are playing on the beach. And it's kind of interesting that if you look up this word molpe in LSJ, you will see that almost all of the citations for it are to do with song. So it's a word that is incredibly heavily loaded. And actually this is cited, this Odyssey passage is cited as the only example of it not meaning song. And I think we need to engage in some critical philology here. I think essentially this is a sexist reading of the Odyssey that is transported into the Argonautica. There is absolutely no reason to deny that Nausicaa and her maidens are singing while they play ball, and I don't think there's any reason to deny that Medea and her maidens are singing either. The second passage, you can see the word molpe is repeated, but both passages have other words that are associated with song. So that adjective melikia in line 3 of the first passage, which I've translated as gentle, is overwhelmingly applied to speech acts in Greek. And then in the second passage, the first 4 bolded words So I'm not sure if you can really see on the screen, the definition isn't as clear, but melpomenes, athuroi, molpen, and epsiastai, all of these words are associated with song elsewhere in Greek literature. So obviously melpomene is the name of one of the muses, as well as a verb for singing. Athuroi is a verb that's associated with playful or bawdy songs. And the infinitive is actually used in the Odyssey, specifically of enjoying song, and elsewhere in that context too. So you can see here it's associated with song, and the word molpe is used. In an epic where every word is weighed so carefully, it seems impossible to me that Apollonius is not trying to make us think of music by combining all of these words together in this depiction of Medea and her women. And it seems we can read back into this, of course, once we see her actually singing later. So you can think back on this moment and see if you agree with me once we've dealt with that. Before we move on and have a look at her performing, I just wanted to point a little kind of thing here that's really, really interesting, is the use of the word amekanos, which I've said unable. It's very difficult to translate in this context, but obviously it has connotations of powerlessness, of impossibility. And this is a theme that this poem kind of reflects on a lot. Lust or passion and desire stopping you from being able to speak and preventing the kind of poetic enterprise is something that the poet himself reflects on as a narrator, and we see it enacted here in Medea. So the emotion she feels for Jason literally stop her from performing, and that tension is something that we could come back to in the Q&A. So I initially did have a few slides on it, but no time to delve in detail, sadly. So if we just move on then to the beginning of her poetic performances. So Medea does eventually meet Jason. She hands over the drugs. Jason defeats her father's monsters, and Medea realizes she's been rumbled. She's very worried. She initially considers taking her own life, but decides against that. Hera inspires her with the idea of running away instead. And here we see her leaving her home, leaving her maiden bedroom. So what I want to notice here is the blending of erotic and musical language. So the physicality of her departure as she strokes and kisses the fabric of her bedroom, combined with this kind of musical blending of genre. So we're in an epic, but she's about to sing a lament. And the other things to bear in mind are the kind of contrast created by the tender eroticism of her physical contact with the materiality of her bedroom, with the violence that she perpetrates on herself. So she rips out a lock of her hair here. It's a very painful act of self-mutilation, which I think stands in some ways for her recently considered suicide, and also has strong funerary connotations. Think about all of the scenes in Greek tragedy where people leave locks of hair on the tombs of loved ones. We do still here get these headlines of song coming through. So the two bolded words again are words that are strongly associated with song. So the adjective in the last line, hadina, used among other things of the sirens in this poem, while the verb epaphao is used of the deliberate stroke of the musician touching his kithara or his plectrum. So her identity as a song creator is again pointed before we actually hear her lamenting. So this is her lament, and we get it in direct speech or direct song. This is interesting because her magical songs are never given this prominence, so we get a more special marked form of quotation for her lament than we will see in a moment for her much more powerful in some ways songs. So that could be something we discuss in the Q&A as well, why the narrator has made that choice. So here we see the lament enacting her departure from home and the end of her maidenhood. I think the choice of a lament here is quite important. So it foreshadows the doomed end of her relationship with Jason, but it also hints at her capacity for violence. So you can see here she wishes counterfactually that Jason has been broken into pieces. So there is a kind of sense of dismemberment to this verb, dashed you to death, I've translated it as, hard to convey in non-clunky English. Immediately I think we're supposed to think of her brother as Spiritus, so she doesn't actually dismember him in this poem, but Apollonius certainly knew that version of the myth and does keep kind of pushing that button over and over again. So it's actually Jason who dismembers Aspiratus in this poem. But again, we're kind of thinking of other Medeas and about the kind of things we know she's capable of as an audience. So here we get to the magical song. So she gives this lament and she leaves her home, and we're told that her exit from the house is quite literally affected by her songs magically moving the door bolts back. And if you look at the language here, you can see that the door bolts are characterized as dancers leaping in time to her tune. So she's like the choregos, directing them to go where she wills. So the word here, anathroskontes, they leap up, and apsoroi, they leap backwards. So metapoetically speaking, her songs are affecting the plot. How can a young girl escape a heavily guarded palace? This song isn't digressive, as many embedded songs are, and that's what my book is about. So if you want to know more about that, I'm very happy to talk about it more in the Q&A. And they're not necessarily affective, like, for example, the laments of Hecuba, Helen and Andromache in Iliad 24, but truly effective. Without them, she would remain trapped in the palace. Her identity as a song creator emancipates her from her father's house and begins the process of narrative usurpation, which ends with her words blending with those of the poet-narrator. As Medea exits the house, she walks barefoot down the dark path of the garden next to all of the noxious plants that she uses in her potions and spells, and she's seen there by the goddess Selene, the moon, who spots her sneaking out of the house. Selene is very clearly vindictively delighted to see Medea in this plight, and we get this direct speech, the moon kind of addressing Medea from on high, and enjoying the fact that effectively the tables have turned. But there are some quite extraordinary features of this speech, in terms of how Medea is characterized, but also in terms of how the moon speech is given some markers of poetry itself that are important to notice. So firstly, please note how she portrays Medea's power to control and disrupt the natural world. We hear that Medea has repeatedly forced the moon to feel sexual desire for Endymion, which sends the moon then to the cave where Endymion sleeps, so that Medea can perform her magic during the dark night. So how often I went with lovemaking on my mind because of your crafty songs. So she very clearly feels that she has experienced this desire at the hands of Medea. The threat that sexual desire posed to Medea's power, which we saw earlier when Medea was rendered amekhinos and speechless during her tense wait for Jason to join her at the temple for the secret rendezvous, is implicit here again, because Selene at the end of this speech is kind of rejoicing in the fact that no matter how clever Medea is, she's going to suffer the same kind of pain of love, just like Selene did. So this connection between love and kind of your cleverness not working anymore and being amekhinos coming back in. There are also some hymnic features to this song, which are interesting. So the last couple of lines are quite reminiscent of some of the Homeric hymns. So we're in a situation, quite bizarrely, of a goddess to whom hymns should be addressed, effectively addressing a hymn to a mortal woman. Just in case you haven't ever read the Homeric hymns, if you haven't, they're wonderful. I just put a couple up here to show you what I'm talking about. So you can see at the end of the Homeric hymn to Hestia, this word archeo being addressed to the goddess. So that kind of mimetic idea of calling the goddess into being in hymn. And then the imperatives in the other two shorter extracts. So the be gracious, hilef, very similar to the teklathi that Selene addresses to Medea here. Obviously, what is entirely positive in the Homeric hymns is kind of transformed into quite a bitter and sarcastic imperative here. But nonetheless, it still speaks, I think, to Medea's supernatural capabilities, that we end up in a situation where a goddess is functionally performing a hymn, even if it's a bitter one, to her, and recognising her power, her domain, doing a lot of other things that those hymns would do. I bolded Ata and Pema. I'm not going to say anything about them now, but if anyone is interested in the theme in this poem of love, kind of stalling poetry, that's what that's relevant to, and I've got a few extra slides that we can come back to if people do want to discuss that. So, Medea goes off, and despite Selene's nasty hymn, nothing bad happens to her. She meets up with Jason and teams up with him, and she becomes even more instrumental in the second heroic feat that he achieves in this poem than she was in the first. So in his defeat of the Earthborn men, she gives him drugs that make his body invulnerable, but she's not actually there, involved, kind of getting her hands dirty, as it were, in the action. But in the capturing of the Golden Fleece, she's much more directly involved, and something that I think has been slightly overlooked in previous kind of treatments of this scene is the role of song in kind of affecting that heroic endeavour, and in kind of how the impact of her songs change both her own identity and Jason's identity. I wanted to start not with her song used to defeat the snake, but with the snake's own song, because I think it's quite interesting that Apollonius chooses to emphasise the oral effect of the snake's utterance before we get to Medea's answer, if you like, so it almost becomes a kind of amoebean, like song and answer situation. So this snake here is hissing, and the word used is pelorion, monstrously. That word has divine connotations, so it definitely gives us a sense of enormity, strength, kind of uncanny power. And the sound he makes is very clearly a kind of performance. It's a threat. Its reach is huge, equally huge as the snake itself. So we get this vast geographical description of the extent of the sound spread, as well as the image of the rivers and the woods echoing and rebounding the noise back. And yet again, as we've seen is a bit of a theme here, there are words being used that are essentially words of poetry and poetic performance. So, or words that kind of connote a problem with that. So aspeton, the word used to describe the grove, I've translated it, it does mean vast or boundless, but it can also mean unspeakable or unutterable, a very appropriate epithet for the wordless, uncanny, but also vast sound made by the snake. And the verb just next to it, yachen, which I've translated as echoed, is very often found of human song performance, including of songs performed in honour of the gods. And also in this poem, and I think this again is very significant, it is the verb used for the speech of the Argo, when the Argo speaks to Jason elsewhere in the poem. So before we get to her magic song, there's one more thing I want to share with you, and it is, I think it's quite amusing, and it sets up the gender reversal that we're about to see enacted. So the second impact of the snake's speech is given to us in this lovely image of new mothers waking up and holding their babies close to them, the babies having been woken from their sleep by the hissing. So obviously partly this is to establish a sense of kind of just how loud this is, that all across the bay of Colchis people are waking up in their beds. But this gives us a paradigm for an emotional response to the snake, which is about to be echoed not by Medea, but by Jason. So we're kind of being set up here, if we map back once our human characters meet this snake, you know, who's the hero and who's the baby, and I'm afraid you will see that it is Medea is the master of the snake, and Jason following along in her wake like a child obeying his mother. So we get to Medea's magical song. So let's just have a look at this passage. The girl went into its eyeline as it writhed in coils, calling it a sweet voice on sleep, highest of the gods, to be her helper in charming the monster. she invoked the queen who wanders by night under the earth to grant a lucky attack. What jumps out at me here is the fearless approach of Medea, firstly, so not hiding, straight into the eye line of the monster, and the contrast that is immediately created between the brute force of the snake's loud, wordless hiss, which was spreading across the Black Sea, and Medea's sweet voice, which nonetheless has more power. The effect of her song on the monster is instant, so she charms him, and this word immediately recalls to a listener of the poem or a reader of the poem the reaction of the Argonauts and other characters to the bard Orpheus. So this is the verb that's constantly used of Orpheus's music in the poem. So again, she's being figured as a bard. Also note that she uses some martial language here. So although we don't get a direct quotation of her magical song, there is clearly some bleeding or blurring between the words that she used and the report of the song that we get here. So we get some epithets that she uses of the gods that she addresses, kind of coming into the narrative, and also this kind of, she called on the queen to grant a lucky attack. So she's kind of, you know, very much appropriating a heroic approach. And I've called this narrative contagion as a way of describing the blending of two narratives, the narrative of an embedded narrator, if you like, or an embedded performer with the frame narrative. So rather than marking it off with direct speech, Apollonius has let Medea's speech infect or kind of blend into his. He's not quoting her, but she manages to then take over what he's saying and affect the frame narrative and blend these two performances into one. As promised, you can see Jason not exactly reacting as we might expect. There's lots of work on how unheroic he is. This is just a kind of further example, and it's quite interesting, isn't it, if you contrast the material evidence with the text. So on the vase, he's absolutely ready to club that snake. He's very heroic. I think Medea may potentially be ironically obscured by the flash of the camera in this terrible image, which is the only one I could find for this vase. But you can, you know, even if she is there helping him, he's clearly kind of doing his bit here in a way that I don't think he is in the Apollonius version. So you can see he's kind of following her along. He's terrified. And meanwhile, the snake, we get a repetition of the power of the song acting on the snake, so he's bewitched by the song. And then we get a kind of silencing of the snake. So her song has completely overpowered him to the point where he falls silent. We no longer hear his hissing, and he's as silent as the sea and unthreatening. So important that the sea is gentle in the comparison here. As if this weren't enough of evidence that Jason has been to some extent usurped as the hero, Apollonius makes it even clearer. So Jason has no initiative. He can't see that the snake is now subdued. He's obviously still terrified, and he waits for Medea to tell him what to do. So he only takes it at the maiden's command, or when she commands. Contrast his sort of subordinated role here with the description of her as he empedon hestria, so she stands firm, steadfast, she's not afraid, she's completely in control, and he moves only when told. So his heroic act is completely robbed of all valour, really. And you can see here a lovely image of Medea drugging the snake while Jason takes the fleece. Apollonius, not content to leave it there, then presents us with this wonderful simile, which does describe Jason and not Medea. So you can see here Jason rejoicing in his capture of the fleece, and he's compared to a maiden who catches the beam of the full moon in her bedroom on her flimsy dress, and in her heart she rejoices as she sees its gleaming beauty. So Jason lifted the great fleece joyfully in his hands. So I feel like by this point, Medea's songs have very much established her as the hero, and song is the means by which things happen in the epic. Meanwhile, Jason has been relegated to a young girl who's preening herself. So this continues in the next scene, where we can see that his pleasure in the fleece is entirely aesthetic. So he's very interested in kind of rearranging it on his body. So he's walking along, sometimes placing it on his left shoulder, sometimes holding it, running his hands over it. And again, he's still terrified. So he's terrified that a man or a god might meet him and steal it away. So he's lost all of his kind of heroic power and agency. So again, contrast the material culture with Apollonius's presentation. So this Jason doesn't look remotely scared. He's walking along, he's got his sword, you know, no one's going to take that off him. But our Jason is much more interested in how sparkly it is and afraid that someone's going to come and pinch it off him. And I thought this was quite a nice comparison, although it's obviously a much more serious and dark text, but it gives us this idea of how this kind of behaviour might have read to a Greek audience. So this is a scene from Euripides' Medea, where poor Creusa, an innocent victim of Jason's misbehaviour, in my opinion, has put on the poisoned garments sent to her by Medea, and we've got this similar idea of sort of parading around, you know, kind of performing this show of the lovely clothes that she's just received, and obviously it goes very badly wrong for her. But I think that's very much what we're kind of dealing with in this scene where Jason is parading along looking at the sparkly fleece. I think I will stop there, and then we can always come back to this. So this was just the two little extra bits that I had to say about Ate and Pema and the connection between kind of love and speechlessness. But I think we'll just stop with Jason kind of showing off, because it's quite a nice place to finish. Thank you very much.